Everyone thinks they know the story of the serpent in Genesis. The snake is Satan. Eve ate an apple, humanity fell. But if you open the original Hebrew manuscript, the word for serpent is nachash, and that word does not just mean snake, it means shining one, divine being, enchanter. English translations have been burying these meanings for centuries. So what was the nachash really? And what did the ancient Israelites actually understand when they first read this passage in the Garden of Eden? The Hebrew word nachash appears in Genesis chapter 3, verse 1. Most English Bibles translate it simply as serpent or snake, and that translation is technically accurate. Nachash can mean a snake. But in biblical Hebrew, words carry layers of meaning that a single English translation can never capture. The root of nachash, the three Hebrew consonants nun, chet, shin, functions as a verb, a noun, and an adjective. As a verb, nachash means to practice divination, to observe signs, to enchant. As a noun, it refers to a serpent. As an adjective, and this is where things get fascinating, nachash can mean shining one or bright one. The same consonantal root appears in the Hebrew word for bronze or copper, nachash, a shining metal. Biblical scholar Michael Heiser, who spent decades studying the original Hebrew and Semitic languages at the University of Wisconsin, pointed out that the nachash in Genesis 3 could be legitimately read as a shining divine being rather than a simple garden snake. And that reading changes everything about how you understand the scene. Think about it for a second. A talking snake crawling on its belly in a garden is strange enough to be almost cartoonish. But a luminous, intelligent being with divine knowledge, standing upright in the sacred space where God walks in the cool of the day, that is a fundamentally different kind of story. And the ancient Israelites who first heard Genesis, they lived in a world where both interpretations would have been understood simultaneously. The image of a divine serpent was not strange to them at all. It was everywhere. Travel about 500 miles east of ancient Israel to the city of Babylon in modern-day Iraq, and you will find one of the oldest written stories in human existence. The Epic of Gilgamesh, carved into clay tablets around 2100 BC, roughly 1,000 years before most scholars date the final composition of Genesis. In this story, a hero named Gilgamesh searches the ancient world for the secret of eternal life. He finds it, a magical plant growing at the bottom of the sea that can reverse aging and grant immortality. Gilgamesh dives down, retrieves the plant, and begins his journey home. And then, a serpent steals it. While Gilgamesh is bathing in a pool of water, a snake slithers up, eats the plant, and immediately sheds its skin, becoming young again. Gilgamesh loses immortality. The serpent gains it. Sound familiar? A creature associated with forbidden knowledge, the loss of eternal life, a paradise-like setting disrupted by a serpent's intervention. The parallels with Genesis 3 are impossible to ignore, and scholars have been debating them for over a century. The Gilgamesh tablets, now housed in the British Museum in London, predate the written form of Genesis by centuries. This does not mean Genesis copied Gilgamesh. That is a common oversimplification. What it means is that both stories emerged from the same cultural soil, the same ancient Near Eastern world where serpents, trees, gardens, and the quest for immortality were deeply intertwined symbols that everyone recognized. But the Gilgamesh connection is only the beginning. In the ancient Sumerian poem known as Enki and Ninhursag, dating to roughly the same period, a paradise called Dilmun is described as a pure, clean, bright land where there is no sickness, no death, and no old age. Sound familiar? In this paradise, the god Enki eats forbidden plants, and the mother goddess Ninhursag curses him. One of the healing goddesses created to cure Enki's rib is called Ninti, a Sumerian name that means both Lady of the Rib and Lady of Life. In Genesis, Eve is created from Adam's rib, and her name, Chava in Hebrew, means life or living. The parallels between Ninti and Eve are so precise that Sumerian scholar Samuel Noah Kramer, working at the University of Pennsylvania Museum in Philadelphia, called it one of the most striking literary connections between Sumerian and biblical literature. These are not coincidences. These are literary conversations happening across centuries and civilizations, all centered on the same cluster of images: gardens, forbidden knowledge, serpents, ribs, and the loss of immortality. And Babylon was not the only place where serpents held this kind of power. Travel south from Israel into the Nile Delta of ancient Egypt, and you will find serpent imagery carved into virtually every major temple and tomb. The uraeus, the rearing cobra worn on the crown of every pharaoh from the Old Kingdom onward, was a symbol of divine authority, protection, and royal power. The serpent goddess Wadjet was one of the oldest deities in the Egyptian pantheon, worshipped at the Temple of Buto in the Nile Delta as early as 3100 BC. In Egyptian cosmology, the great serpent Apophis represented chaos, yes, but another serpent, Mayhem, coiled protectively around the sun god Ra during his nightly journey through the underworld. Serpents were not simply evil in Egypt. They were cosmic forces, capable of both destruction and protection, depending on their role. Now, the Israelites who composed Genesis had just spent 400 years living in Egypt, according to the biblical narrative in Exodus. They would have seen these serpent symbols every single day, carved into temple walls, painted on sarcophagi, woven into the crowns of the rulers who enslaved them. When the writers of Genesis placed a nachash in the Garden of Eden, they were not writing in a cultural vacuum. They were responding to the serpent traditions of every civilization surrounding them. And they were making a deliberate theological statement that their original audience would have grasped instantly. But here is the detail that most readers miss entirely. The nachash in Genesis 3 is described with a specific Hebrew adjective. The text says, "The serpent was arum." Your English Bible probably translates this as cunning or crafty. And again, that translation is not wrong, but it hides something remarkable. Just one chapter earlier, in Genesis 2, verse 25, the same Hebrew word appears in a different form. Adam and Eve are described as arumim, meaning naked. The nachash is arum, meaning shrewd or cunning. In Hebrew, these two words share the same root. The author of Genesis is creating a deliberate wordplay between the nakedness of the humans and the shrewdness of the serpent. This kind of wordplay is everywhere in the Hebrew Bible. It is one of the primary literary techniques ancient Hebrew writers used to convey meaning. And in this case, the pun links the vulnerability of the humans with the cleverness of the serpent in a way that English readers completely miss. The humans are exposed, unguarded, innocent. The serpent is covered, calculating, experienced. The wordplay sets up the entire scene before a single line of dialogue is spoken. The original audience would have caught this immediately and understood that a contest between innocence and cunning was about to unfold. And the dialogue itself is worth examining closely, because the serpent's strategy in Genesis 3 is far more sophisticated than most Sunday school lessons suggest. The nachash opens with a question. Did God really say, "You must not eat from any tree in the garden"? Now that is a misquotation. God never said they could not eat from any tree. He said they could eat from every tree except one, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the center of the garden. The serpent's question is designed to make God's command sound unreasonable. By exaggerating the restriction, the nachash forces Eve to correct it, and in doing so, she engages with the serpent's framing. She is now in a conversation she never needed to have. Eve responds by correcting the misquotation, but she adds her own detail that does not appear in God's original command. She says, "We must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and we must not touch it, or we will die." The original command in Genesis 2 says nothing about touching the tree. Eve has added to God's words. Scholars have debated for centuries whether this addition reveals something about Eve's state of mind, whether she is being overly cautious, or whether she has already begun to distort the original instruction. Some rabbinical commentators in the Talmud argued that this extra prohibition, this fence around the law, is actually what made Eve vulnerable. By adding a rule God never gave, She created a standard she could visibly violate without immediately dying, which would make the serpent's next claim seem credible. And the serpent's next claim is the boldest statement in the entire passage. "You will not certainly die," the nachash says. "For God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." This is not a simple lie. And this is where the theological debate gets genuinely complicated, because in a very specific sense, the serpent tells the truth. Adam and Eve eat the fruit. They do not immediately drop dead. Their eyes are opened, and God himself confirms in Genesis 3 verse 22 that the humans have indeed become like one of us, knowing good and evil. The nachash was technically accurate about the immediate physical outcome. The deception was not in the facts, but in the framing. The serpent presented knowledge of good and evil as pure gain, as promotion, as becoming divine. What the serpent left out was the cost. The knowledge came with death, not instantly, but inevitably. It came with exile from the garden. It came with the loss of direct access to the tree of life. Early church fathers were divided on this exact question. Origen of Alexandria, writing in the 3rd century AD from the great library city of Egypt, argued that the serpent mixed truth with falsehood in a way designed to confuse. Augustine of Hippo, writing from Roman North Africa in the 4th century, emphasized that the deception lay in the implied promise that autonomy from God was desirable. Irenaeus of Lyon, writing even earlier in the 2nd century from Roman Gaul, took a different approach entirely and argued that Adam and Eve were not fully mature beings, but childlike creatures who were not yet ready for the knowledge the serpent offered. In Irenaeus's reading, the sin was not desiring knowledge itself, but grasping for it prematurely, like a child reaching for a fire. This diversity of interpretation within the first few centuries of Christianity shows how much genuine ambiguity exists in the text. Genesis 3 is not a straightforward morality tale. It is a narrative deliberately constructed with layers of meaning that different traditions have excavated in different ways. This is a pattern that literary scholars call the half-truth, and it is considered one of the most effective forms of persuasion in ancient literature. You give someone accurate information but strip away the context that would change their decision. The serpent never lied about what would happen. The serpent lied about what it would mean. Now let us talk about the tree itself, because the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is one of the most misunderstood phrases in the entire Bible. In English, it sounds like a tree that teaches you the difference between right and wrong, morality, ethics. But the Hebrew phrase tov va-ra, good and evil, is what linguists call a merism. A merism is a figure of speech where you name two extremes to represent everything in between. When the Bible says God created the heavens and the earth, it does not mean God only created those two things. It means God created everything. Heavens and earth is a merism for all of reality. Similarly, good and evil does not mean just morality. It means everything, total knowledge, the kind of comprehensive awareness that belongs to the divine realm. The tree offered something like omniscience, the ability to determine and define reality on your own terms, independent of God. That is a fundamentally different proposition than simply learning right from wrong. The ancient Israelites understood this because the same merism appears elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible. In 2 Samuel chapter 14, verse 17, a woman tells King David that he is like an angel of God in discerning good and evil. She is not saying David knows the difference between right and wrong. She is saying David has divine-level discernment, wisdom that transcends ordinary human understanding. So the serpent was offering Adam and Eve something far more radical than a moral education. The nachash was offering them autonomy from God, the power to define reality for themselves. And that offer is exactly the kind of temptation that ancient Near Eastern readers would have recognized immediately, because it mirrors the ambition of divine beings in mythology across the entire region. In Canaanite mythology, preserved on clay tablets found at the ruins of Ugarit in modern-day Syria, divine beings constantly scheme for greater power and higher status within the divine council. The god Athtar tries to seize the throne of Baal on Mount Zaphon. The sea god Yam challenges the authority of El, the supreme deity. These stories of divine overreach and rebellion were the cultural background against which Genesis was written. The Ugaritic texts, discovered by French archaeologist Claude Schaeffer beginning in 1929, when a farmer's plough struck a buried tomb on the Syrian coast, revealed a Canaanite religious world far more complex than anyone had imagined. The tablets, written in a cuneiform alphabet around 1200 BC, describe a divine assembly where El presides over a council of gods. This image of a divine council appears repeatedly in the Hebrew Bible itself. Psalm 82 opens with the declaration, "God stands in the divine assembly. In the midst of the gods he renders judgment." The Hebrew word Elohim, used for God throughout Genesis, is grammatically plural and in some passages clearly refers to multiple divine beings, not just the one God of Israel. When the serpent tells Eve that eating the fruit will make her like God, the Hebrew actually reads, like Elohim, like the divine beings, like the members of this cosmic council. The nachash is offering Eve a place in the divine assembly, a seat at the table where cosmic decisions are made. And the nachash, as a divine creature itself, would know exactly what that offer entails. At Ugarit, archaeologists also found bronze serpent figurines in the temple precinct, confirming that serpent worship was practiced in Canaan during the exact period when the Israelites were settling in the same region. A striking bronze serpent was discovered at the site of Timnah in the Negev desert of southern Israel, at a copper mining site used by both Egyptians and Midianites around the 12th century BC, roughly the period of Moses according to traditional biblical chronology. The Timnah serpent was found inside a tent shrine that some archaeologists have compared to the Israelite tabernacle. The serpent was everywhere in the ancient world that produced the Bible. Understanding this context does not diminish the Genesis story, it amplifies it. The authors of Genesis were not inventing serpent symbolism from scratch. They were taking a symbol that every culture around them revered and reframing it within their own theological vision. And this brings us to one of the most debated questions in all of biblical scholarship. Was the serpent in Genesis 3 actually Satan? The honest answer, the one that makes a lot of people uncomfortable, is that Genesis itself never identifies the serpent as Satan. The word Satan does not appear anywhere in Genesis. The serpent is introduced as one of the wild animals that the Lord God had made. It is a creature, not a fallen angel. It is described using the same Hebrew word, chayat hasadeh, beast of the field, that describes the other animals God created. The identification of the serpent with Satan developed much later in Jewish and Christian tradition. The clearest connection appears in the Book of Revelation, chapter 12, verse 9, written roughly 1,000 years after Genesis, where the author describes that ancient serpent called the devil, or Satan. But this is a New Testament interpretation imposed backward onto a Hebrew text that does not make this identification. In the Hebrew Bible's own internal timeline, the figure of Ha-Satan, the adversary, appears as a member of the divine council in the book of Job, probably composed around the 6th or 5th century BC. In Job, the Satan is not a fallen angel or an enemy of God. He functions more like a prosecuting attorney in a heavenly court, testing the faithfulness of humans with God's explicit permission. The Satan in Job walks into God's presence, has a conversation with God, and receives permission to afflict Job. This is not a rebel. This is an authorized agent operating within the divine hierarchy. The development of Satan as a cosmic villain, a fallen angel who rebelled against God and was cast out of heaven, is largely a product of the intertestamental period, the centuries between the Old and New Testaments, when Jewish apocalyptic literature dramatically expanded the mythology surrounding evil and spiritual warfare. Books like First Enoch, Jubilees, and the writings found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran near the shores of the Dead Sea introduced elaborate stories about fallen angels called Watchers who descended to earth, corrupted humanity, and were imprisoned by God. These texts, written between the 3rd century BC and the 1st century AD, heavily influenced early Christian theology and shaped the way later readers understood Genesis 3. The book of 1st Enoch, which survives in its complete form only in the ancient Ethiopic language Ge'ez, preserved by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church in Addis Ababa, describes 200 angels called Watchers who descend to Mount Hermon on the border between modern-day Lebanon and Syria. Their leader, Shemi-Hazar, organizes the rebellion. Another figure, Azazel, teaches humans metallurgy, weapon-making, and cosmetics. These details might sound minor, but they represent something radical. In this telling, the corruption of humanity is not about a single act of disobedience in a garden. It is about unauthorized transfer of divine knowledge to human beings. The crime of the Watchers is the same crime the serpent commits in Genesis 3, giving humans access to knowledge that was meant to remain in the divine realm. The Dead Sea Scrolls community, living in the desert settlement near the caves where the scrolls were discovered in 1947 by a Bedouin shepherd, produced their own literature that dramatically expanded the cosmic war between good and evil. The War Scroll, found in Cave 1 at Qumran, describes a final battle between the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness. The community rule divides all of humanity into two spiritual camps, governed by a Prince of Light and an Angel of Darkness. This dualistic worldview, where a cosmic evil being actively opposes God, was heavily influenced by Persian Zoroastrianism during the Babylonian exile, when Jews lived under Persian rule after Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in 539 BC. Zoroastrian theology featured Angra Mainyu, a destructive spirit who opposes the supreme god Ahura Mazda. Many scholars at institutions like Yale Divinity School and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem have argued that this Persian influence reshaped Jewish theology and contributed directly to the development of the Satan figure, as Christians later understood it. Take a step back and think about what that means. The Satan you picture when you hear the word, the red devil with horns and a pitchfork, that figure was assembled over centuries from Persian theology, Jewish apocalyptic literature, and early Christian interpretation. Genesis 3 does not contain that character. It contains a nachash. Neither reading is necessarily wrong, but understanding that these are different readings, emerging from different historical moments, changes how you approach the text entirely. Now, something strange happens after Adam and Eve eat the fruit that almost nobody talks about. God shows up. He walks through the garden in the cool of the day, a Hebrew phrase, leruach hayom, that literally means in the wind of the day, or in the spirit of the day. This is God taking an evening stroll through his garden, and the image is remarkably physical, remarkably personal. Adam and Eve hide among the trees, and God calls out with a question that theologians have debated for millennia. Where are you? Did the omniscient creator of the universe not know where two humans were hiding behind a fig tree? Most scholars agree this is not a question born of ignorance. It is a question born of relationship. God is giving Adam the opportunity to come forward, to confess, to be honest about what happened. It is a pastoral question, not a GPS query. Adam's response is telling. I heard you in the garden and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid. Notice what happened. Before eating the fruit, Adam and Eve were naked and felt no shame. After eating it, the very first emotion they experience is fear, not enlightenment, not power, fear. The knowledge the serpent promised would make them like God immediately produced terror in the presence of God. What follows is a blame chain that echoes through the entire rest of the Bible. God asks Adam if he ate from the forbidden tree. Adam says, "The woman you put here with me, she gave me some fruit from the tree, and I ate it." Notice the double deflection. Adam blames Eve, but he also blames God. "The woman you put here with me. You did this. You gave me this woman. This is your fault." God turns to Eve. "What is this you have done?" Eve says, "The serpent deceived me, and I ate." Each person in the chain passes responsibility to the next. Now, The judgment God delivers in Genesis 3 is one of the most carefully structured passages in the entire Hebrew Bible. God addresses the serpent first, then Eve, then Adam, reversing the order of the temptation. And the curse on the serpent contains some of the most mysterious language in all of Scripture. "Because you have done this," God says to the nachash, "cursed are you above all livestock and all wild animals. You will crawl on your belly, and you will eat dust all the days of your life." The phrase, "you will crawl on your belly," has generated enormous debate. If this is a literal snake, was it walking upright before the curse? Some ancient Jewish commentators, including those in the Midrash Rabbah compiled between the 3rd and 5th centuries AD, said yes. The serpent originally walked on 2 legs, perhaps even had wings, and was reduced to a crawling creature as punishment. If the nachash was a divine being, a shining one, then the curse represents a demotion from a position of honor and authority to the lowest possible state. Eating dust in the ancient Near East was an idiom for humiliation and defeat. When a king conquered a rival in Mesopotamian literature, the defeated enemy was described as licking the dust at the victor's feet. Assyrian and Babylonian conquest inscriptions found on stone monuments across Iraq and Syria use this exact imagery. The nachash is not literally eating dirt. It is being stripped of its status and made to grovel in the lowest position imaginable. But the curse is not over yet. The next verse is the one that theologians have fought over for 2,000 years. Christians call it the Proto-Evangelium, the first gospel. Genesis 3, verse 15. God says to the serpent, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." This single verse has generated more theological commentary than almost any other line in the Hebrew Bible. Christian tradition, beginning as early as the 2nd century with Church Father Irenaeus of Lyon, interpreted this as a prophecy about Jesus Christ. The offspring of the woman who will crush the serpent's head is Christ, and the serpent striking his heel represents the crucifixion, a wound that is painful but not fatal, while the crushing of the head is fatal. Jewish interpreters have read it differently. In the Targum, the Aramaic translations of the Hebrew Bible used in synagogues during the Second Temple period, this verse is interpreted as a general statement about the ongoing conflict between humanity and evil, not a specific messianic prophecy. The Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, probably compiled between the 4th and 7th centuries AD, adds the detail that the serpent's defeat will come in the days of King Messiah, but this is an addition to the text, not something Genesis itself states. The Hebrew itself is genuinely ambiguous on a critical point. The word translated as he in "he will crush your head" is the Hebrew pronoun hu, which could refer to the offspring, to the woman, or even to a collective group. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible made in Alexandria, Egypt around the 3rd century BC, translated this pronoun as autos, a masculine singular, pointing to a single male figure. The Latin Vulgate, translated by Saint Jerome in Bethlehem around 400 AD, used ipsa, a feminine pronoun, making the crusher of the serpent's head the woman herself, which became the basis for centuries of Catholic Marian theology. Same verse, different translations, radically different theological conclusions, and both sides can point to legitimate linguistic evidence for their reading. The history of how Genesis 3 verse 15 has been translated is itself a fascinating story of theological influence shaping language. When King James commissioned a New English translation of the Bible in 1604, the team of scholars working at Westminster Abbey and the Oxford and Cambridge colleges chose he for the pronoun, aligning with Protestant theology that saw Christ as the serpent crusher. The Douay-Rheims translation, produced by English Catholic scholars working in exile in France between 1582 and 1610, followed Jerome's Vulgate and used she, maintaining the Marian reading. Two English Bibles produced by Christians reading the same Hebrew text within decades of each other, arriving at opposite translations of a single pronoun, each supporting their tradition's theological emphasis. This is not a flaw in the text. This is the text doing exactly what ancient Hebrew literature was designed to do. The ambiguity is the feature, not the bug. The biblical authors wrote in a language where multiple meanings could coexist within a single word, where wordplay and double entendre carried theological weight, and where the reader's own tradition and context shaped which layer of meaning surfaced first. Modern readers, who want the Bible to give them one clear, unambiguous answer to every question, are asking the text to be something it was never designed to be. If you are enjoying this deep dive into the hidden layers of Genesis and want to see more investigations like this into the ancient texts, subscribe to the channel right now. We cover the mysteries, the archaeology, and the original languages behind the Bible's most fascinating stories every week. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one. After the judgment, God does something unexpected. He makes garments of animal skin and clothes Adam and Eve. Think about what that means. To provide skin garments, an animal had to die. This is the first death in the biblical narrative, and it happens at God's initiative, not as punishment but as provision. The humans tried to cover their nakedness with fig leaves in Genesis 3, verse 7. God replaces their insufficient covering with something that cost a life. Theologians have read this as the first sacrifice, a foreshadowing of the sacrificial system that dominates the rest of the Hebrew Bible. From Abel's offering in Genesis 4 to the temple sacrifices in Jerusalem described in Leviticus. The pattern is established here in the garden. Human efforts to cover shame are inadequate. Divine provision, at the cost of innocent life, is required. The rabbinical tradition adds a fascinating detail. The Midrash Rabbah, compiled in the great academies of Roman Palestine between the 3rd and 5th centuries AD, records a debate about the material of these garments. Rabbi Meir's Torah scroll, according to the tradition, read the Hebrew word as or, with an aleph, meaning light, rather than or, with an ayin, meaning skin. If Rabbi Meir's reading is correct, God clothed Adam and Eve in garments of light, not animal hide. The difference between the two Hebrew letters is invisible in the unpointed consonantal text that would have been the original manuscript. This means the first humans were either stripped of luminous garments when they fell, or given animal skins as a practical replacement for a covering they lost. Either way, the imagery reinforces the idea of a radical transformation, a descent from a higher state of being. This connects directly back to the nachash. If the serpent was a shining one, a luminous divine being, and if the original humans were clothed in light, then the scene in the garden becomes a confrontation between two kinds of radiance: divine brilliance, corrupted by pride, meeting human innocence about to be corrupted by ambition. The entire story operates on multiple levels simultaneously, and each level reveals something the others conceal. Up to this point, Adam and Eve had only lost innocence. Now, they lost everything. God stations cherubim, the cheruvim, at the eastern entrance of the Garden of Eden, along with a flaming sword that turns every direction to guard the path to the tree of life. These cherubim are not the chubby baby angels of Renaissance paintings hanging in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. In ancient Near Eastern art, cherubim were massive winged creatures with the bodies of bulls or lions and the faces of humans. Archaeologists have found ivory carvings of these exact creatures in the ruins of Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. Similar winged guardian figures flanked the entrances of Assyrian palaces in Nineveh and Nimrud in modern-day northern Iraq. The British Museum in London has several of these colossal Lamassu statues, human-headed winged bulls that stood as supernatural guardians at doorways. By placing cherubim at the Gate of Eden, the author of Genesis is using imagery that every ancient reader would have recognized. These are divine bouncers, sacred guards. The garden is now a restricted zone, and the tree of life, the source of immortality, is permanently off-limits. This detail matters because of what it reveals about the structure of the story. The serpent promised that eating from the tree of knowledge would make Adam and Eve like God. What actually happened is that they lost access to the other tree, the tree of life. The pursuit of divine knowledge cost them divine life. They traded immortality for information, and the information turned out to be awareness of their own vulnerability. Now, there is one more layer to this story that connects everything we have discussed, and almost nobody talks about it. The Garden of Eden, as described in Genesis 2, is not just a garden. When you analyze the Hebrew text carefully, Eden functions as a temple. This idea, proposed by scholars like Gordon Wenham and Gregory Beale at their respective posts at the University of Gloucestershire and Westminster Theological Seminary, is based on a striking series of parallels between the garden description and the later design of the Israelite tabernacle and temple. In Genesis 2, God plants the garden and places Adam there to work it and keep it. The Hebrew words used here are avad and shamar. These same two words appear together later in the book of Numbers, chapter 3, verse 7 and 8, to describe the duties of the Levitical priests who served in the tabernacle. Avad means to serve or worship. Shamar means to guard or keep watch. Adam is not a gardener in the modern sense. He is functioning as a priest in a sacred space. And if Adam is a priest, then his failure takes on a completely different dimension. A priest's job is to guard the sacred space from anything that does not belong there. When the nachash enters the garden and begins speaking to Eve, Adam is present. Genesis 3 verse 6 says Eve gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. Adam was right there. The priest whose duty was to guard the holy place stood silent while an intruder corrupted it. The sin in this reading is not just eating forbidden fruit. It is abdication of sacred responsibility, a priest who failed to protect his temple. This interpretation helps explain why God's first question is directed at Adam, not Eve, even though Eve ate first. Where are you? Is not just a question about physical location. It is a question about vocation. Where were you when you should have been guarding? Where were you when you should have been fulfilling the role I assigned you? The garden has an eastern entrance, just like the tabernacle described in Exodus chapter 27. Both the garden and the tabernacle contain gold, precious stones, and flowing water, details explicitly mentioned in Genesis 2, verses 10 through 12. The menorah, the seven-branched lampstand inside the tabernacle, is shaped like a stylized tree, likely evoking the tree of life that once stood in the original sacred space. God walks in the garden using the same Hebrew verb, hithalek, that describes his presence dwelling in the tabernacle in Leviticus chapter 26, verse 12. The cherubim who guard the entrance to Eden after the exile reappear as golden figures mounted on the lid of the Ark of the Covenant inside the Holy of Holies, the inner sanctum of the tabernacle, and later the temple built by King Solomon in Jerusalem around 960 BC. The parallels are not coincidental. Once you see them, you cannot unsee them. The author of Genesis is telling the reader that Eden was the original temple, the place where heaven and earth overlapped, where God and humanity existed in direct, unmediated relationship. The serpent's intervention did not just cause a moral failure, it caused a cosmic rupture. Humanity was expelled from the sacred space, and the entire rest of the biblical narrative, from Sinai to Solomon's temple to the prophet's vision of a restored creation, is about the long, painful process of getting back in. That reframes the entire Bible, not as a rule book, not as a collection of stories, as one long exile narrative and the search for the way home. And the serpent, the nachash, the shining one, the cunning creature who stood at the crossroads of knowledge and immortality, reappears throughout the Hebrew Bible in forms that almost nobody connects to Genesis 3. In the book of Numbers, chapter 21, the Israelites are dying from venomous snake bites in the wilderness of the Sinai Peninsula. God tells Moses to make a bronze serpent, a nachash nekoshit, and mount it on a pole. Anyone who looks at the bronze serpent lives. Notice the wordplay again. Nachash, the serpent. Nekoshit, bronze, the shining metal. The shining serpent on a pole becomes a source of healing and life, the exact opposite of the serpent in the garden who brought death. Centuries later, according to 2 Kings, chapter 18, verse 4, King Hezekiah of Judah destroyed that bronze serpent because the Israelites had begun worshipping it, burning incense to it as if it were a god. They called it Nehushtan. The symbol God intended for healing had become an idol. The serpent's power to fascinate and attract worship did not end in Eden. It followed Israel through its entire history. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 6, the prophet has a vision of God enthroned in the Jerusalem temple, and he sees creatures called seraphim flying above the throne. Each seraph has 6 wings and cries out, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty." The Hebrew word saraph means burning one or fiery one, but the same word appears in Numbers chapter 21 and Deuteronomy chapter 8 to describe the venomous serpents in the wilderness. The seraphim of Isaiah's throne room vision are literally fiery serpents, luminous serpent-like beings serving in the divine presence. This detail stuns most readers when they first encounter it. The creatures worshipping God in his heavenly throne room share the same name as the deadly snakes that attacked Israel in the desert. Read that again. The angels around God's throne are fiery serpents. Serpent imagery in the Hebrew Bible is never one-dimensional. These beings exist on a spectrum from divine guardian to deadly threat, from worshipper to enemy, and the same Hebrew word covers the entire range. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 14, and the book of Ezekiel, chapter 28, prophets describe the falls of the kings of Babylon and Tyre, using language that echoes the garden narrative. The king of Tyre is described as having been in Eden, the garden of God, adorned with precious stones, placed on the holy mount of God, and then cast down for pride and violence. These passages, written between the 8th and 6th centuries BC, show that the garden story and the figure of the fallen divine being remained active in Israelite prophetic imagination for centuries. Whether these prophetic texts are describing literal supernatural events or using the garden mythology as a literary framework to condemn human kings depends on which scholarly tradition you follow. Both readings have serious academic support. The point is that the serpent narrative in Genesis 3 was never a standalone story. It was a seed that grew branches across the entire biblical canon, and the branches extended far beyond mainstream Judaism and Christianity. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, a collection of religious movements known collectively as Gnosticism produced radically different readings of the Genesis serpent story. Gnostic texts, many of which were discovered in 1945, buried in a sealed clay jar near the town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, turned the traditional reading completely upside down. In Gnostic texts like On the Origin of the World and the Hypostasis of the Archons, now preserved in the Coptic Museum in Cairo, the serpent is not the villain. The serpent is the hero. In these readings, the God who created the material world is a lower, ignorant deity called the demiurge, and the serpent is an emissary of the true, higher God who is trying to liberate Adam and Eve from the demiurge's prison garden. The fruit of knowledge is not forbidden because it is dangerous. It is forbidden because the demiurge wants to keep humanity ignorant and obedient. One Gnostic sect, the Ophites, named after the Greek word ophis meaning serpent, actually worshipped the snake of Eden as a divine liberator. Early church fathers like Epiphanius of Salamis and Hippolytus of Rome, writing in the 3rd and 4th centuries, described these groups with a mixture of horror and fascination. The Ophites reportedly placed a live serpent on their communion table and allowed it to crawl over the bread before eating it. Yeah, that actually happened. Now, mainstream Christianity decisively rejected Gnostic readings. The councils and theologians who shaped Orthodox doctrine viewed the Gnostic interpretation as heretical. But the very existence of these alternative readings proves an important point. The Genesis serpent narrative is so rich, so layered, so packed with ambiguity that intelligent readers in the ancient world could arrive at completely opposite conclusions about what it meant. The text supports multiple readings not because it is poorly written, but because it is extraordinarily well written. Even today, the serpent of Genesis continues to generate imagery that most people encounter without realizing its origin. The rod of Asclepius, a single serpent wrapped around a staff, has been the symbol of medicine and healing since ancient Greece. Asclepius, the Greek god of medicine, was associated with serpents at his temple complex in Epidaurus on the Greek peninsula, where non-venomous snakes were kept as part of the healing rituals. The connection between serpents and healing, between venom and remedy, runs through the ancient world like an underground river, surfacing in Genesis, in Numbers, in Greek mythology, and on the side of every ambulance driving through modern city streets. Next time you see one, you will think of the nachash. In the Gospel of John, chapter 3, verse 14, Jesus himself references the bronze serpent of Moses. Just as Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness, Jesus says, so the Son of Man must be lifted up, that everyone who believes may have eternal life in him. The serpent on the pole becomes a typological image of the crucifixion, a source of death transformed into a source of life. The nachash symbolism comes full circle, from the garden to the cross, separated by thousands of years of literary and theological development. And in the final book of the Christian Bible, the book of Revelation, written on the island of Patmos in the Aegean Sea, probably around 95 AD, the serpent reappears one last time. Revelation chapter 22 describes a new heavens and new earth, where the tree of life stands once more, bearing 12 crops of fruit, its leaves for the healing of the nations. The cherubim are gone. The flaming sword is gone. Access to the tree of life, lost in Genesis 3, is fully restored. The entire arc of the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, can be read as the story of humanity's exile from and return to the garden. And at the hinge point of that story, at the moment when everything changed, stands a creature whose name means serpent, diviner, and shining one all at once. What makes the Genesis serpent story so endlessly fascinating is that it refuses to be simple. It is not a fairy tale about a talking snake and a forbidden apple. The word apple never appears in the Hebrew text, by the way. The fruit is simply peri, fruit, unspecified. The apple tradition comes from a Latin pun. The Latin word for evil is malum. The Latin word for apple is also malum. When Jerome translated the Bible into Latin in the 4th century, the wordplay was irresistible, and the apple stuck. So the apple is a Latin accident. The snake is a shining divine being. The tree offers not morality, but total autonomous knowledge. The garden is a temple, and the curse is not just punishment, but the beginning of a cosmic restoration project that spans the rest of Scripture. Every layer you peel back reveals something the surface reading missed, and that is perhaps the deepest lesson the Genesis serpent story has to offer. The things you think you know about this text, the assumptions you inherited from paintings and children's books and 2-minute Sunday school summaries, those assumptions are the fig leaves. The real story is underneath, written in a language most of the world has never read, waiting for anyone curious enough to look. The serpent asked the first question in the Bible: did God really say? Maybe the best response is not to fear the question, but to take it seriously enough to go back to the original text and find out what God actually did say. If this video changed the way you see the Genesis story, you will want to watch the video on screen right now, where we investigate another hidden layer of the Hebrew Bible that most English readers have never encountered. Click it now.